So Kate, great to meet you. Lovely to speak to you. It would be lovely just to hear a little bit about your somewhat unique career journey, if you wouldn't mind, about where you've come from and where you are today, and what your role entails.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, as I say. So I'm Kate Butterfield. I'm not actually at the moment head of AI at the World Economic Forum. I gave that up in April to join the World Economic Forum's Center for Trustworthy Technology, which I now lead as executive director. So I didn't actually go far from the forum, just to a little off branch. So I started my career as a barrister, and I was a human rights barrister. And people say to me, well, how did you get from this place to this place? And I actually say that I think that the golden thread that runs through my career is that I always concentrated on helping people. And so as a barrister, you get the privilege to help people who are in distress, in very difficult situations, if you're a human rights lawyer, on a one-by-one basis. As my career progressed and I became a professor, so I was a barrister, I then became a judge. I absolutely hated being a judge, and we could talk about that in the future if you want to. But then I became a professor, moved to the States, and then I was helping sort of a classroom and multiple students. And then I moved into tech, really driven by this passion for what will the world look like for human beings in the age of AI. And so now I'm sort of trying to help the whole world think about this.
I mean, as you probably saw when I posted that I was excited about meeting you on LinkedIn, you know, the world of AI has transformed so many areas already, but I think we'd all agree it's just really at the very beginning of a huge impact on society, on work, on life in general. So it will be really interesting as we go through the session today to just hear your thoughts on that. What's your personal view of the impact that AI has the potential to have? Where do you see that? I mean, what excites you about it? Perhaps is an easier question to raise.
Okay, well, I think what excites me about it, and what excites all of us working in this, and you know, we're often seen as the naysayers because I work in policy. I talk a lot about risks of AI rather than the benefits of AI. But I don't think any of us would be giving our entire lives and our passion to this if it wasn't for the fact that actually we believe that if we get it right now, we can lead a really good life for humanity and the planet using AI. And so, you know, I could just throw out some things. Education. We struggle to educate people around the world. And yet we know that education lifts everybody's boats. And so Africa, just as an instance, classes in Africa are often 60 children spread through all ages. If we could create the miracle of getting all of those students to be in class with one another and to be in class with their teachers, but also have AI to help them to be educated, we could achieve that benefit of education for all. Obviously, one of the problems of doing that is that we still have 3 billion people about who don't have access to the internet. So that's one of the challenges that we have to solve to actually see all the benefits of AI for everyone. And so, you know, often you see quoted in the newspapers, oh, this number of people are signed up to ChatGPT, to GPT-3. And actually, you know, it's a minuscule number compared to the billions of people in the world and the billions of people who don't have access to the internet. So education's one thing, healthcare is another. Just on Monday, at the Center for Trustworthy Technology, we convened a meeting around the use of quantum with AI in drug discovery. And there are huge opportunities in healthcare generally, but in drug discovery and benefits for us. So yeah, I think they're everywhere, dotted around. But we need to get the underpinnings of responsible AI and indeed responsible quantum, because it's just around the corner, right, in order to really harness those benefits.
Absolutely. I mean, it's being sort of lauded as the fourth industrial revolution. It's highly press-worthy. So, you know, all the impacts that it can have, as you've already highlighted, you're focusing on the risks. The press like to focus on the newsworthy stories and highlight the more perhaps apocalyptic view of the world being overrun by automation and nobody having any work. But I suppose as someone who's looked at this over the years as it's evolved, if we look at previous revolutions, previous industrial revolutions, you know, work changes, jobs change as a result of evolution and what transforms. So, you know, I look at it from a technical, as a recruiter, as it were, and an ex-techie in a quite an excited mindset, and look at, well, what is this going to mean? How are we going to adapt? What's going to happen to society? Which, by the sounds of things, is exactly what you're focusing on as a team to monitor and ensure that the right processes are being followed. One of the things that's often talked about is regulation. And I had the pleasure of interviewing a lady who you may know, Bina Amanath, who's focused very heavily on AI and its impacts and the controls, should we call them, or guidances that should be applied to create AI that can be relied upon and trustworthy to deliver sensible and correct outcomes. What would be your advice to organizations that are dipping their toe in the water, or creating AI environments? What would you say are the things that they will start to look at from that perspective, or should start to look at?
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, I know Bina well as a friend, and also she sits on my board. So
there you go.
So I probably endorse anything that Bina said, although I haven't seen the interview. Let me just, so, you know, we've got policymakers on one side, and I'm going to set them aside, because I think the question that you're driving at is, what should businesses be doing? And so there are, if we think about regulation, the regulation that's sort of coming at you fast is the European AI Act. And if you haven't got people looking at what will happen to your use of AI once the European AI Act comes into force, then you're behind the curve. You need to get on board with that right now. But that's, and I think that what's interesting about that regulation is that it has the possibility of being exactly the same as GDPR. Not all of it, because some of it is localized to the EU and the way that Europe thinks. But what we saw with GDPR is sort of two things. First of all, many of the companies just said, okay, well, we've got to do it for Europe, so we'll do it for everywhere. But also what we saw is that a number of governments that perhaps didn't have the money or the time or the knowledge to think about how you implement a data regulation picked up all or bits of GDPR. And so I think we're likely to see that, which is why this act is so important. One of the problems for Europe is that they have to get it passed before they have the next elections, because if they don't, then it might languish and we might go through lots more cycles. And so I think keeping an eye on that is important as well. But we also have just seen this week, or last week and this week, the White House moving to create this group, this forum, and it's just been announced today, of major tech companies to try to think about safety of large language models. And they've not only announced it, but also they're now calling for members. So if you are going to be using generative AI extensively in your business, and you work in your business work is based or has work in America, it might well be worth looking at whether you fit into the category of the people who can apply to be part of that forum. So there's a call for participants out at the moment. I think that we're also beginning to see bits of regulation spread out around the world, or at least bits of advice from governments. So, you know, Japan started all this way back in 2015 or so with the first government's ethical principles. They haven't got regulation, but India has a regulation that sort of looks as if it's going to go through. It has the support of Modi now. Brazil is also looking at regulating. And so you're sort of seeing a disparate picture. And also, if you work in the US, then you really need to be aware that actually the governor's website is your friend, because what we've seen in the absence of federal law is a mishmash of states getting into the act and passing acts. And so actually regulation in the United States is at that state level.
Okay. So, because when I met with Bina, it was only months ago. And this is the challenge, isn't it, that industry will face and that regulators will face. It is the pace of change is extraordinary. And we were discussing whether self-regulation would have to be more controlled. We talked about the fact that when organizations are building teams, they'll need to make sure that the teams are able to monitor and control the guardrails and the data sets that are utilized within some controls. But when we look at and the legislation and the impact on that, do you think that will slow down? Having regulation, will that slow down the pace that we've seen, the innovation that's coming through?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I didn't talk about self-regulation, but I'd love to talk about self-regulation because I do think that it's actually at the moment really important. And so maybe we can double back to that, and then I'll answer your question first about innovation. Actually, innovation can be spurred on by constraint, and we see that in many areas. So, you know, we've got the FDA in the States, and lots of legislation around drug discovery, but that doesn't impede drug companies still discovering drugs. What the actual problem for drug companies is actually those 3 stages of trial and the cost. So it costs between $11 and $15 billion to produce a new drug, and most of them fail in that 3rd stage, which is the stage where you test with human beings. And one of the things that we're hoping that we will see with AI is that actually we can cut the cost of those trials. So it's not let's get rid of the FDA, it's more let's cut the cost of the first 2 stages by using AI to better look at molecules and look at the drug that you're building. But no, we still want to test on human beings before it's allowed out into the wild.
Okay. So with regard to the self-regulation piece, then, if we double back to that, so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think at the moment it's it's a requirement of any company that doesn't want to be considered to be untrustworthy or non-responsible. And, you know, who wants to hold that moniker? It's a brand value problem. It's because if you get it wrong and your customers turn against you, because, for example, the bias issue, that's obviously going to affect your bottom line. I think it's something. I spoke at Davos with Brad Smith and the CEO of HSBC about the fact that this really has to be on the CEO's radar now. It's not just about vision, and that's terribly important. You know, I would say that the CEO needs to know weekly what's happening in AI, because otherwise, how can you envision where your company is going to be? But it's also about where is the C-suite, where is AI being used in the company? And so it's sort of a village. It's a C-suite village that needs to know, because you might have your hiring people using AI. We know that that's a very dangerous use of AI. There's lots of legislation either in the pipeline or actually out there at the moment around it. And, you know, you don't want to be sued for getting it wrong. You don't want to be the first person. And what we know is that the regulators are now looking in these areas. So in the States, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission has actually come out with a number of other regulators and said, we are going to use the existing law. There might not be law about AI, but if you are using AI and you discriminate against a person in a job, then it's your problem. It's not the AI. So you might, you know, be able to add the person who sold you the AI to your lawsuit, but the lawsuit will be against you. So you really need to be ensuring that you don't just give this to the CTO and say, okay, well, you know about what's going on in AI in your company, because often actually different verticals are using it. And when I was at the forum, we actually produced a toolkit for the C-suite to use so that they can come together and monitor that use. So I'd recommend anybody to have a look at that. And then the other piece of self-regulation is the board. And many boards are not understanding all of this because it's moving very, very quickly. And some of them don't even have the technical expertise to understand it. So again, at the forum, it's a little out of date now, but we did produce a toolkit for you to use, for boards to use, with lots and lots of questions for you to ask the C-suite to make sure that you actually can do, you know, execute your governance responsibilities in the age of AI. I have to say the caveat on both of those is that it's pre-generative AI. But what I would say about generative AI is it's simply put all of the problems that we were trying to solve with ordinary AI on steroids.
Okay, so is that how you would describe it? Is that how, because, you know, people often, there'll be a very mixed community of people watching this this presentation, and some will have very deep understanding of AI and generative AI and quantum AI, and others will be joining just because they're fascinated by the subject and fascinated by you and want to hear more about your story, but which we'll come on to in a moment. But how could you put into lay terms, I suppose, how generative, if I'm not putting you on the spot, how generative AI actually works? What goes on behind the scenes?
Yes, I mean, it's a great question. It's a great question, especially because we're sort of seeing, we know how it works, but we're also seeing the scientists who are working with it say things like, we're beginning to see signs of intelligence. And so those are the sort of things that obviously get caught up into the existential risk area. So let's just look at how this actually works. It works by predicting the next word that is going to occur. And the way that happens is that so these large language models are mainly trained on all of the data available on the internet. There are huge issues with the fact that it's only trained on all the available data, because that leaves out large numbers of people's points of view, because their data is simply not as well represented as other people's data. And I think it's really important when we're thinking about the geopolitics of this, and just the gender balance and the global South, global North divide, that we hone in on the fact that the bulk of the data that's being searched when you use these tools is written by white guys. It's not written by women. It's not written by people of color. It's not necessarily written by people with disabilities, because that's the data that's available. Men have been creating data much more than the rest of us for generations. And so what we are in danger of doing when we use these tools, unless we think about it really carefully, is not just continuing the biases, which we all know that AI has, but also ensuring that for the future, the predominant voice will be a global North white voice for all the things that we ask this computer. So it's a huge, huge issue, and I couldn't not bring it up because you've got me on to talk about women in AI.
Exactly.
And so that gender balance issue is enormous. But going back to how the algorithm uses the data. So having been trained on all of this data, what it's doing is looking for the very best prediction of what the next word will be. So it's predicting the next word. What happens miraculously, you might say, is that very often it comes up with very fluent, very eloquent answers to your questions that are right. Obviously, occasionally it gets it completely wrong and makes things up. And so that's a risk that you need to be aware of if you are using these tools. But let me just move then to what Peter Lee is the VP of Research at Microsoft, and he was involved in training GPT-4. In his book, he says, well, we can't just say it's a prediction, it predicts, because, for example, if you ask it how to put a sofa on top of a roof, it will be able to tell you. And that's a really complex problem. And obviously, the computer has no idea of what space looks like. It's not spatially aware because it has no vision of what space looks like. And so those are the sort of things that make the scientists begin to either be concerned or enjoy the fact that we might be seeing a development of intelligence in large language models. I think there are two aspects of that. You could explain it by saying, well, that's a stunt that lots of fraternities do in Frat Week. And so therefore, somewhere it's written down and the computer's just found it. Or you could say, well, it's interpreted it from the number of pictures that it's ingested. And I think the other piece that people should be aware of is what we're beginning to see now, which we call AI cannibalism, which is that the computers are now producing new data at a higher rate than from their own pieces of work, at a higher rate than we humans are producing data. And so what's happening now is that, the computers are using the data that they produced to inform them for the next piece of data. So if this was wrong, this will become wrong. And you're probably seeing that, lots of users of some of these tools are saying, oh, it's getting so much dumber and I don't understand why. Well, it seems that AI cannibalism is the reason why. And that may or may not be able to be solved, and may be a limitation on generative AI. We don't know yet.
Wow. Okay. Because I suppose, the word that's used, and you've used it repeatedly during that description, is the word tool. And I think, from my personal perspective, if we look at AI as something which helps us do things better as humans by shortening the time it takes to do research, by providing choices, providing information that enables us to use our human capabilities to make decisions or to add emotion, which tech so far isn't particularly great at. That then becomes something very powerful that can make our own lives and our capabilities easier. One of the things that we've seen, and I'm sure anyone that's has been in the press, it's been in the tech world, is things like more creative things, music, art being produced by AI, which is some of it's incredible and really clever. Some of it's very strange. We've got the ongoing challenge currently with people in the arts, particularly in the film industry, fighting the risks of AI, of replacing actors and those sorts of activities. What do you think are how is that something that can be managed? I mean, this is something that obviously it's currently very much in the news. So what are your thoughts on that? Is it going to limit creativity, I suppose, is the question, do you think, or is it going to increase and enhance it?
Yeah, well, I think we have to hope that as human beings, we are endlessly creative and we will continue to be creative. And we'll continue to be creative as human beings, but also with, as you say, in conjunction with AI. And I think that it's that in conjunction with AI that we have to be thinking about very carefully. So as you correctly put it, the opportunities for us to use AI wisely together are massive. The problem is when we use AI to actually take the human out of the loop. And, one of the things we know is that that some jobs are going to be lost to AI. So service call centers, for example, AI is very soon going to be able to do that. And so then what do those humans do? We know that that some of these machines can pass the bar. And so, those of us who are the solicitor's profession, I don't think so much the barristers at the moment, the solicitor's profession are seeing them being used, and that's going to affect the jobs of lawyers, doctors, as well, as we have been seeing and continue to see. And so I think we will see a loss of knowledge workers and to AI. And so what we have to do is to really work on making sure that actually we optimize for using the human and the machine, because we don't want to lose those knowledge workers. Because if you think about the economy, it's those knowledge workers that are in the middle and upper income brackets, and losing them would have an enormous effect upon the economy. And when we're thinking about the economy, what we also have to think about is that robotics is very far behind knowledge. So AI can replicate and can do some of the jobs that we knowledge workers can do. But AI-enabled robots are doing manual things like making clothes, dyeing things, building houses, all of those sort of things that probably we knowledge workers don't want to do. Those are going to be the jobs that will be, for the time being, safe from the developments in artificial intelligence. And so as we're looking at this, it's not, we shouldn't just be looking at risks in terms of our businesses, but we should be looking at the economy as a whole. We do know from past revolutions that, that eventually it all comes right. It's that portion in the middle that we need to be fairly laser focused on for the next 10, 15 years.
Very good. Interesting. I mean, it's quite, I was just having a quick look at some of the questions that are coming through, and it's quite interesting because there's a fairly consistent theme. So if I take the theme rather than each individual question, it comes back to the debate we had a few minutes ago about regulation, about controls. And I think also brings in the point you made earlier about the countries that still need to develop to take advantage of technology in general, the lack of the internet globally, etc. So if we look at, I suppose, with a positive light, people are looking at those liberal democracies that are, you know, hopefully well controlled, know what they're doing, have sensible models. But do you think there needs to be a global or an international regulatory focus that to support and drive the things that you're already talking about?
Yeah, sure. Well, let me first go back to those liberal democracies. You know, there's a lot of talk in the press about existential risk, and we can talk about that later if you want. But I actually think that the existential risk currently is that in 2024, over half of the world's population by GDP will vote. So there are elections for over half the world's GDP, up in the 70%. If we don't have some control over the way that information is disseminated by algorithms, is misused by algorithms, then we might be in a very difficult situation. We might find ourselves in 2024 in a very difficult situation in our liberal democracies. And we know the path. So let's just look at nudging and manipulation. We know that it's a jolly good idea for us to wear our Fitbits and be told that we've sat in front of our desk far too long and we should go jogging. But that very same thing, that very same algorithm can be tuned to actually manipulate us into going jogging so that we lose our agency to do something. And so that's the issue that faces us in the next year. And it's coming up on us very fast. So I just wanted to make that point about liberal democracies. The second, what was the actual question, Mike? Because I went off on a liberal democracy.
Yeah, no, sure. Into more of if we're looking at the global impact, should there be a more global regulatory framework to ensure, I suppose, that, you know, underdeveloped countries are not left further behind and not seeing the benefits? How can that be approached? Because this pace of change, as we've touched on, is the thing that is so difficult for governments to control, for regulation to apply to. So, I mean, I know these are massively complex questions to be asking, but it's just interesting to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, obviously we are part of thinking about global regulation and global coalitions. So the World Economic Forum has just created a coalition. The UN met last week to talk about this subject. UNESCO came up yesterday with some recommendations about the use of AI in education. And those are actually very important. And I think that it's worth us everybody having a look at those. The OECD has produced principles that most of their members have signed up to. And we do actually have a global body, which includes a lot of members of the Global South, called the Global Partnership on AI, which was created by Macron and Trudeau about 4 years ago. So there is a lot of international work going on. there are suggestions from people like Stuart Russell that we should have a global organization like the Atomic Organization. I think that it would be great for us to have a global organization. I think that it can't look like the atomic one because, nuclear is generally held by countries, and you can send observers in to check. It's much harder with generative AI, which everybody can use. So, how do you send observers in to check how people are using it? So that's the main problem. It would be, we've seen the G20 coming out and saying, well, we want to do something together. We've seen the G7 also working with OECD to do something. But I suppose I'm not optimistic, to be fair. What we have been trying for the last 7 or 8 years to get the world just to agree not to have lethal autonomous weapons. So for those of you who don't know what a lethal autonomous weapon is, it's an algorithm which can make its own decision to kill. And we've been unsuccessful with just that one piece. So how we would be successful across the board, as I say, I'm not optimistic.
I mean, it certainly sounds like it's something that needs to be kept at the very top of the agenda.
Absolutely.
I
think at the other point, Mike, is that, we've got lots of principles. There are 190 sets of principles around the world. Everybody agrees that there are 9 things that we want, wherever you are, whether you're in China or Africa or UK. Everybody agrees on about nine of those principles. But the problem is constantly, how do we make those principles move into practice? And that's just as true for government as it is for organizations. And, I was having a conversation. One of the things that we do at CTT is help organizations put their principles into practice. And I was having a conversation with somebody saying, well, I've got 10,000 people in my company. How do I make sure they all are putting responsible AI first when they think about anything? And one of those things, there's obviously a passel of things, but one of those things is it has to come from the C-suite. The CEO has to legitimize the fact that everybody has to put responsible AI first.
Yeah, and I think that's a really nice link back to the main sort of subject that we were talking about, which is women in tech, but also about your journey, your experience. And when we think about the C-suite and the fact that global corporates who are building and creating and fueling the growth of AI, because let's be honest, it's not cheap to build these things. It's quick, but there's a lot of work that has to go in, and we're seeing the fight amongst the larger corporates in the tech world who are trying to bring out the latest thing because it's revenue generative as well. So really it comes back to them holding themselves accountable and ensuring that, I suppose, the teams that are making decisions and the self-regulatory piece, I think, is probably something that's quite essential, that they start to hold each other out and start challenging each other to make sure that they're working together with some external influence from governing bodies to support that. But if we look at those teams, we can almost bring this back to your journey and your experience, which is where we started this. So obviously you're a woman who's had a fascinating career. You've moved from the legal world into the tech world. What's been your experience as a woman coming into the tech world versus your life in law? Because both very generally male-dominated environments. What can you share from that perspective?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm old. So when I first became a barrister, it was a very, very male-dominated profession. I don't think so much now. But when I was thinking about this question, I was thrown back to, what you need to survive as a woman in tech being very much the things that I needed to survive as a woman as a barrister. And I thought, gosh, that was the 20th century. We haven't moved very far if I'm going to be giving exactly the same advice to women in tech now. So I think that's the first thing that I wanted to point out. In terms of my journey, I'm not really a woman in tech. I'm not a woman in tech in the way that Bina is, who actually has the tech background. And so I was one of a handful of people who started the responsible AI movement way back in 2014. And so it wasn't so much that I was objected to as a woman. It was more that the idea that we were talking about, this responsible AI thing, was objected to in those days. And so, and I think, I'm older and wiser now and more able to stand up for myself. So, when I was thinking about this, what were the things that I needed as a barrister? I think I needed resilience. I needed self-belief and determination to keep going, even though, often judges were very critical in those days. And I think that you if you have you need to build a community around you, so that every time you get knocked back, you can stand up and keep going. I do think that I do quite a lot of mentorship. I do think that finding yourself a good mentor is extremely important to you being successful, whether it's in the law or in the field of tech. What I'm encouraged by, in fact, because it's important that we have diverse voices, is that a lot of the people leading responsible AI in their companies are women or persons of color. So that's a good counterpoint to the fact that a lot of the technologists are guys under 30. And it sort of brings together the point that's so important when you're thinking about self-regulation, that whenever you decide to make a product using an algorithm, you bring a diverse team together. And that's diverse academically as well as diverse by gender.
Perfect. Well, look, timing wise, we're probably pretty much at the top of the meeting, which is a shame, because it's been really fascinating. I think if we reflect on what you said, there's clearly great opportunity, but some worrying signs that the pace of change needs to be controlled, and people need to be holding themselves accountable. I think we can all, as society, keep an eye on things and keep lobbying and pushing for regulation and ensuring that businesses and global organizations are being monitored and supported, but we also can't hold back progression. So I think it's quite a fascinating subject. I think it's going to run and run. I hope we have the opportunity. I imagine what this conversation will be in 6 months, because the pace of change is so significant that I think things will have changed even in that space of time. And yeah, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. I wanted to thank you sincerely for your time. It's been really good to hear your experience. Great that you're seeing women taking greater responsibility for AI inside organizations. Having diverse teams, as you say, enables the AI that's being built, the engines that are being built, the tools that are being created to appeal and support a wider population, a wider percentage of the population. So let's hope that common sense continues, common sense prevails, and we see the value that we all hope it will bring.
Thank you. It's been an utter pleasure.
Thank you for your time. Thanks, everybody.